looking at his book, Mirror to America, he says something in there that I think is appropriate to begin this discussion. That when he was born in 1915, he didn't know, obviously at the time, but that the next decade would set about some very important events that would be important in his later life. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was referring to the Tulsa race riot. I imagine that's what you are referring to. I'm referring to it anyway. And the riot began in early June the 1st, 1921. I was 6 years old. I was born in a village about 60 miles south of Tulsa called Rentersville, named for an African-American landowner and land speculator. Bought up a fair amount of land in that community and created the town of Rentersville. It was not a terribly successful enterprise or undertaking. And my mother and father, who had moved there about 5 or 6 years before I was born. I'm sorry, I turned it off. About 5 or 6 years before I was born, had some interesting experiences there. It was a small and unconnected community. That is, it had no real backing, not even from Renty, who owned the land. And within a short period of time, it struck up on hard times as though it had not ever had them. And my father, in 1921, early in the year, February, decided to move on as a lawyer trying to establish a practice. The community was not really viable. It didn't have enough people. And those people that were there were not terribly energetic or ambitious. And they spent more time arguing with each other than they did in promoting the enterprise of the community. And so he moved on to Tulsa, where at which place he intended to bring us within a matter of months. My mother was teaching school, and 2 of the children were locally in school, and we were not to be disturbed until the end of the school term. So we were going to move to Tulsa in early June 1921, and we were all packed and waiting for him to come for us, and he didn't show, and he didn't come, and we waited. Hours turned into days, which turned into months, which seemed to a 6-year-old a year. And we didn't know what had happened. Then my mother received my mother found a newspaper that had been dropped off at the train station that described a race riot that was in progress in Tulsa. And there were many casualties, the article said. And from that point on, she didn't know whether my father was living or dead. It was several days later that she got a note from him saying that as he went out to look to see what was going on in the riot, he was seized, placed in detention, and kept there indefinitely. And he was able to get a note out to us. He could imagine us waiting at the train station all this time. Well, we weren't waiting there, but we did not know. And we were relieved to learn that he was not harmed, but he said he'd been burned out. He had nothing, and he at that point was busy trying to make contact with his clients and engaged in suing the state, suing the city, suing the insurance companies that were responsible, he felt, for the riot. And he said he'd be there as soon as he could. He came within 5 or 6 weeks, unable to move us then. There was nowhere to move. The black part of town had been devastated, been ruined, been burned to the ground everywhere. And he was practicing law in a tent. And he then explained to us that it would be months, if not years, before he could bring us to Tulsa. Turned out it was 4 years, during which time I grew up in Rentersville until I was 10 years old. Then we moved to Tulsa, and by which time I had had my first experience with the problem of race. I had hoped it would be my last, but it was not.
The census of 2000 says that there are 102 people in Rentersville, and 65% of them are black. And so I can understand how over the years Rentersville has not become as viable a place. But let me bring this full circle. I think that congratulations are in order to you, because Dr. Franklin is coming to us from Tulsa, who are at the Greenwood Center. They're at the University of Tulsa. He has just won the Pinnacle Prize. And that is connected to something else that they are awarding him for, and that is an attempt to try to bring about some racial reconciliation with respect to this issue. Could you talk about that, sir?
Well, it began in 1921 when my father not only sued the city, but sued on behalf of his clients the ordinance, that is the city for passing an ordinance which said that only fireproof buildings could be constructed. Now you can realize how difficult it was for these people without anything, who had been burned out, burned to the ground. How difficult it would be for them to erect fireproof buildings. My father told them to build with orange crates, build with anything. He said, because this ordinance is unconstitutional, I will prove it to be unconstitutional. And his clients were promptly arrested and detained for violating the ordinance. My father took that case on behalf of his clients all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, where the ordinance was declared invalid on the ground that it was mischievous and irresponsible. And people proceeded then to build as they were able to build. And that was the first sort of landmark decision arising out of that terrible situation. But my father was not able, he lost all the other cases. He was not able to retrieve any returns or compensation for his clients from the city or from the state or even from the insurance companies, who always had an excuse that they were not responsible for the conflagration and therefore they couldn't pay. And the courts stood with them and against the black community. And that began a long and arduous and, up to this point, unsuccessful effort to hold anyone responsible for the destruction of an entire community. Many, many hundreds of houses flattened, large numbers of people homeless for months, if not years. Churches burned to the ground. As a matter of fact, when we moved there, my father continued to live there and to visit us fairly often. But when we moved there in 1925, 4 years after the riot, the churches had not been built higher than the basement, you see. I've described as a new kind of architecture. You look over the town, as I did in 1925. I was only 10, but I could see the unfinished edifices everywhere. And I call that a kind of post-riot architecture, you see. But only gradually were the churches and other institutions rebuilt. Very interesting to point out that the schools were not burned because the city knew that it would have to rebuild the schools, and certain other public buildings were not touched. But individual homes, churches, and various other public buildings set aside for civic activity, they were all burned to the ground.
Well, I was involved at one point with something called the Reparations Coordinating Committee, and Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard University, who was involved in that, and understood that the state actually admitted liability in this disaster. But then when those citizens went back to say, let's make it right, nothing happened. And so there is now, as I understand it, going to be a statue in honor of John Hope Franklin and the attempt to bring about racial reconciliation. And Representative Boren and others, representatives from the state of Oklahoma, now have put in a bill, and they're going to look at these sites and make the Park Service responsible for pointing them out. So some little something, it seems to me, has happened to try to at least recognize that there was an incident there and that there should have been something done about it. But let's come back to Fisk.
There's an infinitesimally small gesture. That's a small gesture.
Almost nothing. That's right. Almost nothing.
I want to say that Professor Ogletree reopened the case, as it were, and sued the city and the state for their dereliction. And that suit was brought about 4 years ago.
That's right.
And it's gone all the way through the federal courts up to the circuit court, losing at every stage. And then the circuit court threw it out.
That's right.
And I'm a party in that case. Now I think it can be described as defunct. So we have then moved to the legislative branches of the government to see if we can get any relief there. For it is our argument that justice delayed is justice denied. And more than that, that if you commit an unjust act against a large number of people, a whole community of people, then the statute of limitations does not run or should not run. And the people who are their successors are guilty, as indeed the people who perpetrated the crime in the first place are guilty. The people who are their successors are benefiting from the successes of their ancestors, their predecessors, and therefore they have no business benefiting from that any more than the descendants of slaveholders have to benefit, while the descendants of slaves get nothing.
Absolutely. For those of you who asked me to talk about reparations, you've just heard the classic theory of reparations actually laid out.
Thank you, Laney.
Tonight.
It's been a long evening, but I think it's been a wonderful evening. I could spend a lot of evenings like this. And now, I'll waste no more words. I'd like to present the 2007 Paul Robeson Here I Stand Award to the most distinguished historian in America, Dr. John Hope Franklin. Thank you. Dr. Franklin. Let's step over here.
I am moved beyond words at this citation. It, of course, brings me back to the last time I heard Paul Robeson sing here in Washington in, I think it was the Metropolitan AME Church, but it was a memorable evening, as indeed this has been a memorable evening. And I'm grateful to the Institute, and I'm grateful to all of you who have supported me through the years and who still tolerate me after all these years. And I can only say that in the time left for me, I shall do everything I can to be worthy of this and other tributes that have come my way. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
This next song is one that comes from the very depth of the struggle of my people in America. One that might have been sung by my own father. A few nights ago, I sang in Brooklyn to the General Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, in which my father labored for many years as a minister, and today my brother is pastor of the Mother Church in New York City. This church has a great history. Frederick Douglass printed his paper, The North Star, in the cellar of the Zion Church in Rochester, New York. Harriet Tubman, one of the great abolitionists and founder of the Underground Railroad, by which many of my people came to freedom in Canada in those days. Yes, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and my father might have sung this next song, must have sung it. No more auction block for me, no more pint of salt for me, no more driver's lash for me. Though many thousands are gone, freedom we will have. No more auction block for me. No more, no more. No more auction block for me. Many thousand gone. No more pint of salt for me. No more, no more. No more pint of salt for me. Many thousand